The morning unfolded without ceremony, as it often did along the quiet boundary where the reserve softened into scrubland, where dust settled slowly and the wind moved without urgency, carrying only the faintest scent of distant grass and drying earth. Rangers moving along their usual patrol route noticed her first as an interruption in the landscape, a shape that did not shift when the light shifted, a tawny form lying too still among pale stones and brittle stems. She was stretched on her side, ribs faintly visible beneath thinning fur, her chest lifting in shallow, uneven pulses that barely disturbed the dust resting on her flank. One foreleg was curved inward, protective without effort, as if shaped by instinct even in exhaustion. Only when they slowed, when their footsteps softened to almost nothing, did they see what pressed against her belly, half hidden in shadow and dirt, a small, dark shape tucked into the narrow space between her body and the ground, breathing in brief, fragile rhythms that struggled to match her own. The lioness did not lift her head when they approached, but her ears twitched weakly, flattening and rising again with uncertain resolve. Her eyes opened only halfway, clouded with fatigue yet still alert enough to follow movement, to register unfamiliar silhouettes standing at a careful distance. The cub remained pressed close, its small body rising and falling quickly, one tiny paw flexing against her fur as if searching for reassurance that no longer came easily. Each time the wind stirred, grains of sand slid across their coats, gathering in the creases of her neck and along the cub's rounded back. She responded with a low, barely audible sound, not a call, not a warning, but something closer to breath shaped into vibration, a fragile signal of presence. The ranger stood quietly, reading the language of her stillness, the way her tail lay unmoving, the way her shoulders no longer held the tension of readiness, only the weight of fatigue and pain. One of them knelt slowly, lowering himself until his silhouette softened against the horizon, careful not to fracture the fragile calm that surrounded her. Another murmured under his breath, "Easy, girl," not as command but as acknowledgement, a thread of sound meant to exist without expectation. The lioness's gaze lingered on him for a moment, pupils narrowing and widening as though measuring distance and threat, before settling again into dull watchfulness. Her breathing stuttered, paused, resumed. The cub shifted, lifting its head briefly, revealing eyes still cloudy with newness, before burying its face once more into the shelter of her fur. There was no strength in her posture now, only persistence, only the quiet determination to remain between her offspring and whatever waited beyond her failing body. Every few minutes she attempted to adjust herself, muscles trembling as she shifted weight, only to sink back into the dust with a faint exhale. Around them, the reserve continued its indifferent rhythm. Insects hummed faintly among dry grasses. A distant bird called and was answered far away. Heat gathered slowly along the ground, turning cool soil into warm powder. The rangers exchanged silent glances, understanding without words that time had narrowed, that what remained was fragile and uncertain. They prepared carefully, speaking only when necessary, moving as though each gesture carried weight. As they did, the lioness watched with fading intensity, her gaze drifting between them and the cub, her breaths growing softer, longer between each rise and fall. The cub remained close, unaware of anything beyond warmth and heartbeat, pressed against the last steady thing it knew. Above them, thin clouds passed slowly across a pale sky, and the grass along the boundary stirred, whispering softly in the widening light. The space between the rangers and the lioness narrowed by degrees so small they were almost imperceptible, measured not in steps but in pauses, in breath held and released, in the careful reading of every subtle shift in her body. They did not approach her directly. Instead, they curved gently along the edge of the clearing, allowing her eyes time to follow them, to understand that nothing was moving with speed or intent. Her head lifted only slightly as they drew nearer, muscles along her neck tightening before giving way to fatigue. The effort cost her. After a few seconds, it lowered again, settling into the dust with a soft sound, as though even gravity had become heavier than before. Up close, the signs of strain revealed themselves quietly. One hind leg lay at an unnatural angle, the fur along it matted dark where blood had dried and mixed with soil. A faint tremor moved through her flank with each breath. Her ribs pressed sharply against skin, no longer softened by strength or stored energy. The rhythm of her chest was uneven, sometimes pausing long enough to make the rangers glance at one another before it resumed in a shallow rise. Still, her body curved protectively around the cub, forming a living barrier against the open land behind her. The cub stirred as the human settled into stillness several meters away. It lifted its head weakly, eyes blinking against light and dust, and let out a thin, fragile sound before tucking itself back against its mother's side. One small paw reached blindly, brushing her fur until it found purchase. She responded with a faint shift, drawing the cub closer despite the visible effort it required. The movement sent a ripple of pain through her frame, evident in the tightening of her jaw and the brief flare of her nostrils. Yet she did not pull away. She remained, anchored by instinct stronger than comfort. The rescue team waited. Minutes passed without a word. Knees pressed into dry earth. Hands rested loosely on equipment and used. Their presence became part of the landscape, another cluster of still shapes beneath the widening sky. One ranger whispered softly, almost to himself, "We're here," his voice barely disturbing the air. The sound drifted and faded, leaving no expectation behind it. The lioness's ears flicked once in response, then settled. Gradually her gaze softened. The sharp vigilance of a threatened predator gave way to something quieter, more uncertain. She no longer tracked every movement. Instead, her eyes lingered on their lowered bodies, on their unraised hands, on the absence of sudden motion. The distance between fear and trust remained wide, but it was no longer absolute. It contained small openings now, fragile and tentative. The cub shifted again, crawling a few inches higher along her side until its head rested beneath her chin. Its breathing quickened, then slowed as warmth and familiarity steadied it. She lowered her muzzle slightly, touching its back for a moment before letting her head rest once more. Around them, the wind moved gently through dry grass, lifting dust into thin spirals that dissolved almost as soon as they formed. In that shared stillness, vulnerability became visible on both sides. A weakened mother holding on with fading strength. Quiet humans offering time instead of force. Between them, an unspoken understanding began to take shape, fragile as breath, carried on patience, restraint, and the quiet recognition of something worth protecting. Time continued to pass without clear measure, marked only by the slow arc of light and the gradual cooling of shadows along the ground. The rescue team remained where they were, maintaining the careful distance that had allowed the fragile calm to take root. No one shifted unnecessarily. No one spoke. Even breath seemed restrained, shaped to fit the rhythm of the moment. The lioness lay motionless for so long that her stillness began to feel permanent, as though she had merged with the earth beneath her, another quiet form in the boundary's long, indifferent history. Then, without warning, her body gathered itself. It began with a subtle tightening along her spine, a faint quiver that passed through her shoulders and hips. Her forelegs drew inward. Her head lifted slowly, inch by inch, trembling under its own weight. Dust slid from her fur as she shifted. For a moment, it seemed she might collapse back into the ground, strength spent before it could fully rise. Her breath hitched. Her jaw clenched. Yet she persisted, pushing through pain with small, deliberate adjustments, lifting her chest, finding balance where none seemed left. When she finally stood, unsteady and swaying, the effort left her sides heaving, her ribs moving sharply beneath stretched skin. The cub stirred at once, confused by the sudden change. It made a thin, uncertain sound and attempted to follow, its legs wobbling uselessly. Before it could fall, she lowered her head and carefully gathered it by the loose skin at the back of its neck. Her grip was gentle, precise, shaped by instinct refined through generations. The cub went still at once, suspended between earth and air, trusting the familiar pressure that had always meant safety. Slowly, carefully she turned. Her steps were uneven. One hind leg dragged slightly, leaving a shallow line in the dust. Each movement required visible concentration. Still she did not hesitate. Her gaze fixed on a single point ahead, the ranger who had remained kneeling closest, who had not shifted position for nearly an hour, whose presence had been quiet enough to fade into the background. He noticed the change and froze completely, lowering his eyes and hands, making himself smaller rather than larger. She advanced a few meters, then paused to steady herself. Her breathing rasped faintly. The cub hung silently, its small body rising and falling against her muzzle. After another moment, she continued, closing the space that had once felt immeasurable. When she reached him, she stopped again, standing so close that the dust disturbed by her steps brushed against his knees. Carefully she lowered her head. The cub was placed on the ground between them, resting against his boot, still warm from her body. For a heartbeat she did not release it. Her jaw remained closed, holding gently as though reconsidering. Then, with a final controlled movement, she let go and lifted her head. The ranger whispered, "It's okay," his voice barely more than breath. Her eyes met his briefly. There was no submission in them, no surrender. Only exhaustion, awareness, and something quieter that did not need definition. She remained standing for a moment longer, watching as the cub shifted and pressed instinctively against the nearest solid presence. Around them, the grass bent softly in the breeze, and the boundary between wild distance and fragile trust thinned, not with force, but with a single trembling act of faith. The moment after the cub was placed on the ground passed in near silence, suspended and uncertain, as though the land itself had paused to observe what would follow. The rescue team did not move at once. They remained anchored where they were, aware that any sudden shift could fracture what had just been offered. The ranger closest to the cub kept his hands low and still, palms resting lightly against his knees, eyes lowered. He felt the faint warmth radiating through his trousers, the small, fragile presence pressed against his boot, breathing in quick, uneven rhythms. For several seconds nothing changed. Then the cub stirred. It began with a slight twitch along its spine, a ripple of movement that traveled from its shoulders to its tail. Its head lifted unsteadily, wobbling as though uncertain of its own weight. One forepaw stretched forward and touched the dusty ground, claws barely visible, testing resistance. The cub released a thin, wavering sound, not loud enough to travel far, but strong enough to cut through the stillness. Slowly, with visible effort, it pushed its chest upward, shifting from helpless collapse into a trembling, half-supported posture. The ranger's breath caught quietly, though he did not move. The cub tried again. Its second paw joined the first. Its hindquarters dragged it first, then gathered beneath it. For a moment, it swayed dangerously, balance uncertain, body pulled in opposing directions by fatigue and instinct. Then, almost imperceptibly, it found alignment. It stood. Only for a heartbeat. Only on shaking legs. But it stood. A soft murmur rippled through the team and faded immediately, swallowed by discipline and restraint. Their focus remained steady, attentive, reverent. No one reached out. No one closed the distance. They watched as the cub turned clumsily toward its mother, guided less by sight than by scent and memory. The lioness had not moved far. She stood several steps away, body rigid with effort, head lowered, eyes fixed on the small figure struggling toward her. Her sides expanded and contracted heavily, breath rasping through narrowed passages. As the cub wavered, she shifted her weight, adjusting her stance despite the pain that tightened her muscles. One foreleg slid forward, offering a subtle barrier against a possible fall. Then she released a sound. It was low and soft, barely more than a breath shaped into vibration, yet it carried across the open ground with surprising clarity. It was not a call of warning or command. It was an invitation. A reassurance woven from instinct and endurance. The sound lingered briefly in the air before dissolving into the wider landscape. The cub responded at once. It leaned forward, renewed by something invisible yet undeniable. Its steps became more deliberate. Each movement remained unsteady, but now it was purposeful. When it reached her, it pressed its small head into the curve of her chest, seeking warmth and familiarity. She lowered her muzzle, touching the top of its head with careful precision, holding there for a moment as though anchoring them both. Around them, the rescue team began preparing quietly. Hands moved slowly toward medical packs. Radios were adjusted without sound. Eyes exchanged brief confirmations. Intervention would come, but it would arrive gently, shaped by what had just been revealed. What lay before them now was no longer only weakness. It was endurance in fragile form. It was a body that refused to abandon its purpose. It was a young life answering exhaustion with movement. Above them, clouds drifted across widening blue, and the grass rippled softly in their wake, bearing witness to resilience unfolding where despair had once seemed complete. The shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, almost invisibly, in the quiet minutes that followed the cub's return to its mother's side. The lioness remained standing, though her legs still trembled faintly beneath her weight. Her breathing, once ragged and uneven, began to settle into a slower rhythm. Each rise of her chest became steadier, each pause between breaths less uncertain. The pain had not vanished. The weakness had not dissolved. But something within her had reorganized itself around persistence rather than collapse. She adjusted her stance, placing her injured leg more carefully now, distributing her weight with deliberate precision. Dust shifted beneath her paws as she tested the ground, confirming what could still be trusted. The cub stayed close, pressed firmly against her shoulder, its small body warm and steady, its breathing calmer than before. Occasionally, it lifted its head to nuzzle into her fur, then settled again, reassured by the familiar scent and heartbeat. The rescue team recognized the change before it became obvious. They saw it in the way her head remained lifted longer, in the way her gaze sharpened slightly, no longer dulled entirely by exhaustion. They responded without discussion. One by one they began to retreat, reversing their careful approach with equal patience. Knees rose slowly from the ground. Packs were adjusted without sound. Boots lifted and set down lightly, leaving shallow impressions in the dust. No one turned their back too quickly. No one lingered too long. A ranger murmured softly, "You're strong," though the words were barely audible beyond his own breath. They drifted into the open air and dissolved, carrying no expectation, only quiet respect. The lioness watched them go. Her eyes followed their movement until they became smaller shapes against the widening plain. She did not bristle. She did not retreat. She simply observed, alert yet unthreatened, as though cataloging this brief, improbable encounter before releasing it. When the last of them had stepped beyond her immediate awareness, she lowered her head and touched the cub gently, guiding it closer beneath her chest. Then she turned. Her movement was slow, careful, measured. Each step was placed with intention, mindful of pain, mindful of balance. The cub followed at once, wobbling briefly before matching her pace. Together they moved toward the open land where grasses stretched thin and pale beneath the softening sky. The boundary that had held them in fragile stillness now lay behind them, marked only by faint tracks and disturbed dust. As they walked, the light began to change. The sun drifted lower, warming the horizon with muted gold and amber. Long shadows stretched across the ground, weaving between stones and stems. A distant herd shifted somewhere beyond sight, their movement carried faintly on the wind. Insects resumed their quiet rhythm. Birds crossed the sky in loose, unhurried patterns. The lioness paused once, lifting her head to look back. For a moment, her silhouette stood outlined against the fading brightness, strong and slender despite fatigue, resolute despite injury. The cub pressed against her leg, barely visible in the deepening shadow. Then she turned forward again and they continued. Gradually, their forms softened into the landscape, blending with grass and light and distance, until they were no longer distinct, only part of the wide, breathing plain. The wind moved gently through dry stems. The last warmth of day settled into earth and fur. And somewhere beyond sight, a mother and her child carried on, held by instinct, endurance, and a quiet moment of trust that would never need to be remembered aloud.